Football has a way of kicking you when you're down. 2 weeks after Wembley, 2 weeks sitting with that loss, and Arsenal going to St. Mary's Stadium and they fall again. And that is so frustrating. And before we start to talk about how bad Arsenal were and how poor they were, I think there will be enough, for us to dig into. But this wasn't just about, Arsenal being very, very poor. There's a lot more in that performance, a lot more to unravel. And, I'm recording this the morning after the game because I wanted to sleep on it. I wanted to, look at that game again, just to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. And so, welcome to the Gooner Pavilion. If you're new here, welcome to the family. If you're not and you're returning, I always appreciate you because hopefully we can get a bit more insight into that Arsenal performance and maybe a bit of therapy, as well. So let's get into this because this one was really, really frustrating. And it wasn't because Southampton were lucky and they weren't. And it wasn't because Arsenal didn't create anything. We created plenty. It's frustrating because this felt very familiar. The same sort of feeling from Wembley, where it seemed like the opposition provided questions and Arsenal did not have the answers to it. I was in Wembley for that cup final game, and we all know, the analysis, what everyone thought about Pep Guardiola doing, and I just wonder whether there is, something beyond just what's happening on the pitch. It just feels like things were slipping away, and I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that as Arsenal fans. And hey, listen, the media is gonna escalate this to the nth degree, and we're gonna hear all the bottle jobs and all of those sort of things. Um, but I think let's be honest, about the context, going into this game. Arsenal, came in after a loss. 2 weeks without a match, international break, players traveling, players coming back, at different levels, no rhythm, no continuity, and no real chance to reset this properly. And I thought that the break would have given us the time to, mentally recharge, but it seems like that didn't happen. And of course, Southampton are coming into this game, with a completely different context. Unbeaten at home, I think 5 games unbeaten overall. They're playing at home, their crowd are behind them. And this was one of those games that, in hindsight, you probably wanted Arsenal to be playing at the Emirates and having that home front. If you look at Chelsea, look at Manchester City, playing at home really helps you after the international break. So before the ball was kicked, we already had two very different emotional temperatures for the team. But let's get to the game itself because I know this is what you want to hear. That's why you clicked on this. Um, and, there's a lot that the numbers tell you in this game. Arsenal had 64%, off the ball, 23 shots to Southampton's 8, and 60 touches in the box to their 20. And listen, um, that number is important because it's typically kind of what we tend to do, when we are on top of teams, the amount of entries that we have into the final third, and then 9 corners to Southampton's 4. And yes, Southampton scored twice and Arsenal scored once. So what happened? Southampton were clinical and Arsenal were wasteful. Um, they didn't need control. They didn't need a lot of volume. They just took their moments when they had them. And Arsenal had the control, and that's the familiar story, but never really turned it into something very, very decisive. Um, we'll talk about that forward line because a lot of the criticism is going to go to that forward line, and probably fairly so because this is where the game really starts to show itself. And I don't think this was a collective attacking issue. It was a senior attacking issue. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Havertz never really imposed himself on the game. If you look at his contribution in terms of shots, it was almost negligible. Just look at that, almost negligible. It was almost like he did nothing in that game. We kept waiting for him to take control of a situation, to attack the box, to give you something to play off, and it just never quite happened. And I was talking about this earlier on when I went to play football with a couple of mates, and that I'm not sure Havertz has fully gotten to the match rhythm after his injury. And I think it shows. It shows in his contribution. It makes you feel of that Havertz before the January of 2025, where he just started, becoming the player that now everyone was thinking, we're missing. Where's Havertz, and all of that. Um, Jesus. Okay. Look, that's another player for me. We probably will not see in the Arsenal team maybe next year. I think that's something that's going to be fixed. He was everywhere but nowhere. Right in the game, there were sometimes I saw him coming to get the ball in like the sixth position, coming in deep. He was everywhere but nowhere. In this game, his touches were slightly off. Decisions that he was making felt a little bit late, and moments where you expect sharpness, and just not quite there yet. And for someone who promised a lot in these games, he's really, really contributed very, very little, especially in these cup games in the business end. And I think that's the frustrating part, for Arsenal fans, because this is happening at the business end of the season and not at the time of the season where you can make corrections. And then there's Martinelli, and I'll go a little bit easy on Martinelli because the effort was there, the running was there, but every time he got into dangerous positions, the final action just didn't come together. And when all those are slightly off, you felt it across everything. You did. Your forward line is not, firing. And until Gyökeres came into the second half, then it felt like we're beginning to do something a little bit more. And then, of course, he got the goal as well. Now, if you slow that down for a second, because in a game where, a lot of things didn't quite click, there was one player who didn't look affected by everything, by anything, and that was Max freaking Dowman. Um, Listen, and I don't want to frame this as he was, good for his age, one for the future. He was just good, period. Um, because what we saw was a player that, as the game went on, the more responsibility he seemed to want to take on. And this is so good. It just reminds me of Bukayo Saka when he was breaking into the team, how he literally just put the Arsenal on his back and was just driving Arsenal forward. And he wasn't just forcing things or overplaying things. He just consistently wanted to be involved in the game. You see him drop in, receive the ball under pressure. Southampton, players were really worried about him. Sometimes three or four players, crowding around Dowman. And he would turn, take the ball forward, ride the tackles. And for me, that's the part that really stood out in this game. He wasn't just, keeping the ball; he was moving the ball, um, and and when you watch all of that, you start to notice the contrast. Because when the senior players did not step up, taking an extra touch or playing safe, he wasn't doing that. He was asking questions. Um, and that tells you a lot. That tells you a lot. A game like this, you're playing away from home, hostile crowd, and things not going quite your way. You really want players to step into it, and Max Dorman did that. And for me, that's probably the biggest positive you can take from that night. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk about another player, and is one that is dividing opinion equally, and that's Miles Lewis Kelly. And listen, you're gonna see a lot of people say, some pretty strong things about Miles Lewis Kelly and how they will analyze that game and his contribution. But I don't think he belongs in the same conversation as some of the senior players that I've just talked about. And before we start criticizing him, I think there is context. He hasn't had a run of games. And yes, you're going to say, well, if he's got the quality, he should just show that, right? And after all, it seems like his quality has come down and all of that, and maybe he should be sold. And we've heard about the talks about, Manchester United and all of those things. Um, but I think that at that age, let's not forget how old he is. You need a lot of games to get your rhythm and you need confidence. And when the manager is not playing you in certain games that you should play, you start to have a little bit of doubt, about your performance, about your quality, about the talent that you have. And he's not exactly coming into a team that is flying and performing on all cylinders. He's coming into a team that is kind of in that part where there is a lot of PTSD from post seasons, and not in terms of the players that are there, but in terms of where Arsenal have been in the past and not getting over the line. So no doubt there was a lot of pressure on this game. So when you look at his performance, I think you need to factor that in. While he didn't dominate the game, I don't think he hit either. I think he was coming and looking for the ball a lot of the time, and he kept things moving. And you can see he's still adjusting, to games like this. And games like this, for me, I think are more experienced and will teach Miles Lewis Kelly to be a better player, and that's fine, because that's part of the process of growing and maturing, to be that quality player there. So, guys, normally when I do this, we talk about the three things that Arsenal did well, the three ups and the three downs, and I'm going to go into that, and we touched on some of them, already. Because when you take a step back, from everything, um, just to give it a little bit balance of what that game was, the performance isn't just bad. They're just parts of it that were bad. And overall, you can almost look at that performance and you can say, let's just look at the score. Let's look at the outcome. There were parts of it that were actually fine. First thing, first up, Arsenal controlled the game. And I don't just mean possession, I mean where the game was being played. Most of it was in Southampton's half. We're building around that box, especially in the first half. We were the ones pushing, and what Southampton was doing was really just playing on the counter attack, getting that ball over the top, and we'll talk about that. So structurally, Arsenal weren't just being pulled apart, or things like that. And as the game went on, you could feel something was building, especially in that first half. And it wasn't goals though. It was frustration. And that's the second thing. We didn't just have the ball, we had it in areas that could lead to something, that should lead to something. You talk about the touches in the box, the 60 touches in the box, that's a lot. And it didn't feel like empty possession either. At the time, we weren't necessarily getting the crosses into the box, but we were, getting the attacks in, the second balls, around the edge. The situations were there, and that's what makes this, very difficult, because you're watching and you're thinking it's coming, it has to come. Arsenal has got to score a goal, and it just never quite does. And the third thing is that Arsenal created enough to win this game. Let's be clear. If you look at all the stats, we had 23 shots, and 7 on target. So, there was a lot there. It just felt like the game was opening up. But every time that final moment didn't just come, didn't match the effort, when Arsenal were on top. And, in most games, you're not going to be on top for 90 minutes. But when you're on top, you need to take the chances. And it's a little bit unfortunate, you can say when you have, a goalkeeper that just seems to be on form, in that game. He just was everything that was coming at him, he was piling away. We should have scored with a couple of those efforts there. And and for me, that is the frustration. It's the frustration as I look at the three downs in this game. Um, that game was there to be won, guys. It really was. And the first down for me is the finishing. 23 shots, one goal. And even saying it like that, it just feels like missing something, right? Um, it didn't. We had chances, and we kept getting into positions, and it just seemed that things were just breaking down at the end. Either contact wasn't clean. You saw the chances from Odegaard, just not hitting his shot properly. Um, or we took some wrong decisions when we got into the final third. It just feels like everything was a bit rushed, um, which is very unlike Arsenal, I would say. And that is the difference. It really is a difference between Southampton taking their chances, being very clinical, being very calm, when they got in front of goal, and Arsenal rushing things. And certainly didn't play that the team that had the superior talent or the superior quality. And the second down for me, that attacking unit that never clicked. Havertz, Jesus, Martinelli, not a lack of effort, just a lack of sharpness. And everything just feels a little bit harder. Southampton didn't need many opportunities, they just took them. And listen, the bigger picture, this loss hurts, right? Let's be clear. This hurts a lot because we went from being talked about quadruple, and let's be clear, there will be a lot of Arsenal fans that genuinely, me inclusive, that didn't feel like the quadruple was on. It's just the sequence of things. Obviously the Premier League is the most important thing, and you would have wanted to get the Premier League in the bag. And then maybe if you come out of the League Cup or you come out with the FA Cup, you feel like you've got something. And I think that is that internal frustration that Arsenal fans are feeling right now. It feels like things are slipping away. We lost the League Cup, now out of the FA Cup, and now going into a Champions League. And listen, if I'm Sporting, I'm going to be thinking, I'm going to pray on this. I'm going to make sure that, from an Arsenal perspective, we put a lot of pressure, on them. So we're going to talk about the Sporting Lisbon game, but that that is going to be a pressure game. Listen, Southampton scoring two, Arsenal scoring one, a frustrating night, a deserved win for them. You've got to give them, full marks for finding a way to outperform Arsenal and finding a way to hurt Arsenal, and taking advantage of weaknesses that we had in the squad. And listen, Arsenal need to learn quickly. They really do, because we're now at that business end of the season where you need to lock in. And maybe this is a blessing in disguise, in terms of where things are. And maybe if it turns out that Arsenal splits, the four trophies that could potentially happen, where, we take the league and the Champions League, I think that's still a good season. Um, so guys, listen, if you enjoyed this one, I know it was a little bit more therapy and a lot less analysis and deep diving. But I just wanted to put a little bit of context, put a little bit of perspective into that result that we saw. We're not excusing the bad, we're not excusing the things that Arsenal didn't do well. But it is important to just put all of that into context, and more importantly, not let this derail, what could still be a very, very good season, for Arsenal. So if you've enjoyed that, hit that like and subscribe button, stay with the channel. And we'll be previewing the Sporting Lisbon game. I do that in a different format to check out for that. And yes, this was painful, but we've got bigger prices within our grabs, and let's not, lose sight of that. Come on, you Arsenal.